I never imagined that love could slowly become something I would fear instead of something I looked forward to every day. When I first met my girlfriend, everything felt effortless. She had a warm smile that made every room brighter, an infectious laugh that erased stress from my mind, and a kindness that convinced me I had finally found someone with whom I could build a future. I admired how deeply she cared about the people she loved. I believed that her emotional nature was one of her greatest strengths. I had no idea that the same emotions would eventually consume both of us. At the beginning, the signs were so small that I barely noticed them. She often asked who I was texting or why a female coworker had reacted to one of my social media posts. I answered every question honestly because I had nothing to hide. I even found it flattering that she cared enough to ask. It felt like proof that she valued our relationship and wanted to protect it. As the months passed, those harmless questions slowly became daily interrogations. Every notification on my phone attracted her attention. Every delayed reply to one of her messages became something I had to explain. If I spent an evening with friends, she wanted to know every detail about where I had gone, who had been there, and what we had talked about. I told myself that trust simply took time, and that my patience would eventually reassure her. Instead, the opposite happened. The more transparent I became, the more suspicious she seemed. I shared my location when I went out, sent pictures without being asked, and answered every call regardless of where I was. None of it made her feel safer. Every effort only created another expectation that became impossible to maintain forever. I started noticing changes in myself before I admitted anything was wrong. I checked my phone constantly because I worried I might miss one of her messages. I avoided casual conversations with female coworkers because I feared she might misunderstand them if she ever saw them. I stopped accepting invitations to group events because I knew the evening would probably end with another argument inside her imagination, even if nothing had actually happened. My world slowly became smaller. I convinced myself that sacrificing parts of my social life was a reasonable price for keeping the relationship peaceful. I believed love required compromise, and I wanted to be the kind of partner who made the extra effort. What I failed to realize was that compromise only works when both people move toward each other. I was the only one giving up pieces of myself. She often apologized after difficult days. Her apologies sounded sincere, and I knew she hated how jealous she became. She admitted that she had been betrayed in previous relationships and that every painful memory followed her into ours. Hearing about her past made my frustration soften. I understood that her fears had not appeared out of nowhere. Someone else had broken her trust long before I entered her life. Knowing the reason behind her behavior made it easier to forgive it. It did not make living with it any easier. I spent countless nights wondering what else I could do to prove my loyalty. I had never lied to her. I had never cheated. I had never hidden conversations or deleted messages. My conscience was completely clear, yet I constantly felt as though I was defending myself against crimes I had never committed. The emotional weight became exhausting. One afternoon I realized just how much I had changed. I was sitting alone during my lunch break when my phone buzzed with another message asking where I was and who I was with. Before reading it completely, I instinctively looked around for something I could photograph as evidence. That automatic reaction frightened me more than the message itself. I had stopped living naturally. Every ordinary moment had become something I needed to document. I missed the version of myself who never thought twice before making simple plans. The relationship slowly turned into a cycle that repeated every week. There would be a few peaceful days filled with affection, laughter, and hope. During those moments I remembered exactly why I loved her. She was thoughtful, intelligent, funny, and incredibly supportive whenever I faced challenges outside our relationship. She celebrated my successes as if they were her own and encouraged me whenever I doubted myself. Then something insignificant would happen. A coworker would send a work-related message after office hours. Someone would like an old picture online. A cashier would smile while handing me my receipt. Any random event could become the beginning of another storm inside her mind. Once those fears appeared, logic disappeared. No explanation felt convincing enough because the real battle was not against facts. It was against insecurities that facts could never erase. I slowly understood that trust could not be built by presenting evidence every day. Trust had to exist even when evidence was unavailable. That realization hurt because it meant I could not solve the problem alone. Despite everything, I never stopped loving her. That was the most confusing part. Love did not disappear simply because life became difficult. If anything, I loved her enough to recognize that she was suffering too. Her jealousy was not making her happy. Every accusation left her emotionally drained. Every anxious thought stole her peace just as it stole mine. We were trapped inside different versions of the same prison. She feared losing me. I feared losing myself. For a long time, I believed those two fears could somehow coexist without destroying what we had built. Eventually I realized they could not. One evening I looked back at old photographs from the beginning of our relationship. I noticed something that had nothing to do with appearances. My smile looked different. There was a carefree confidence in my eyes that had slowly disappeared over the past year. I had become someone who constantly anticipated conflict instead of enjoying the present. That realization stayed with me for days. I stopped asking whether I loved her enough. Instead, I started asking whether love alone was enough. The answer was painful because it forced me to acknowledge something I had spent months avoiding. Love without trust slowly becomes survival. Every day turns into another attempt to prevent the next misunderstanding instead of creating new memories together. I wanted a future where we celebrated each other's independence instead of fearing it. I wanted a relationship where honesty was accepted instead of constantly questioned. I wanted to come home feeling appreciated rather than investigated. Most of all, I wanted both of us to experience peace. For the first time since we met, I accepted that no amount of reassurance from me could heal wounds that only she could choose to confront. I could support her. I could encourage her. I could remain kind and patient. What I could not do was carry fears that were never mine to begin with. Loving someone sometimes means staying beside them through difficult seasons. Sometimes it also means recognizing that staying exactly as things are will only deepen the pain for both people. I still remembered the woman who made me believe in effortless happiness. I knew she still existed beneath layers of anxiety and fear. I hoped she would eventually find the confidence to believe she deserved genuine love without constantly expecting betrayal. As for me, I finally understood that healthy love should make two people feel lighter, not heavier. It should inspire trust instead of endless suspicion. It should create a safe place where both hearts can rest instead of remaining permanently on guard. I never stopped loving her. I simply reached the point where loving her could no longer mean losing myself. Walking away emotionally was much harder than walking away physically. Even after admitting to myself that our relationship had become unhealthy, I still woke up every morning hoping something would suddenly change. I hoped she would wake up one day free from the fears that had followed her for years. I hoped I would once again feel excited every time my phone lit up instead of instinctively wondering whether another misunderstanding was waiting for me. Those hopes kept me in place longer than I cared to admit. I became an expert at reading her moods before she said anything. A slight change in the way she looked at me could determine the atmosphere for the rest of the day. If she seemed unusually quiet, my mind immediately searched for something I might have done wrong. I replayed conversations from earlier that week, trying to identify a sentence that could have been misunderstood. Most of the time I found nothing, yet the anxiety remained. Living that way slowly reshaped my personality. I had always been outgoing, someone who enjoyed meeting new people and making spontaneous plans. That version of me faded little by little. Friends stopped inviting me as often because I usually declined. Family gatherings became shorter because I worried about being away from my phone for too long. Even when I was surrounded by people who cared about me, part of my attention remained focused on preventing another conflict before it even began. I realized I had been managing emotions instead of living my own life. One weekend I visited my parents after several months of postponing the trip. They were happy to see me, but I noticed my mother studying my face more carefully than usual. She never directly asked whether something was wrong, yet I could tell she sensed that I carried a weight I had never brought home before. That evening, I caught my reflection in the bathroom mirror and understood why. I looked permanently tired. Dark circles surrounded my eyes, and the smile that used to appear naturally now felt forced. I had blamed work, lack of sleep, and stress, but deep down, I knew the real source. Constant emotional tension leaves marks that no amount of rest can erase. Driving back home, I kept thinking about the person I had been before the relationship. I was not trying to romanticize the past or pretend that life had been perfect. I simply remembered feeling free. I made decisions without calculating how they might be interpreted by someone else. I laughed without wondering whether my happiness would later become evidence against me. The contrast was impossible to ignore. I still loved her deeply, but I could no longer deny that the relationship was changing me into someone I barely recognized. For the next several weeks, I paid closer attention to patterns instead of individual incidents. Every accusation eventually led to reassurance. Every reassurance provided temporary comfort. Then another fear appeared, and the cycle began again. Nothing was actually improving. The problem was never the specific situation. The problem was the expectation that something terrible was always about to happen. I began reading about insecurity, attachment, and emotional trauma because I desperately wanted to understand what we were experiencing. The more I learned, the more I realized that trust cannot be borrowed from another person forever. Someone can offer reassurance, but eventually lasting security has to come from within. That realization filled me with compassion instead of anger. I stopped viewing her as someone who wanted to control me and started seeing someone who was constantly fighting invisible battles inside her own mind. Every ordinary event felt threatening because her past had taught her that happiness could disappear without warning. Understanding her pain made me gentler. It did not make the relationship healthier. There is a dangerous difference between explaining someone's behavior and accepting behavior that slowly destroys your own peace. For months I confused those two things. I believed empathy required endless sacrifice. Eventually I discovered that empathy without boundaries becomes self-neglect. One rainy afternoon I sat alone in my apartment while she was visiting relatives. The silence felt unfamiliar. There were no notifications demanding explanations. No anxious questions waiting to be answered. No pressure to prove where I was or what I was doing. For the first time in months, I felt completely relaxed. Instead of making me happy, that realization broke my heart. Home should have felt peaceful even when we were together. The fact that I only experienced calm when I was alone forced me to confront a truth I had been avoiding. Love had become associated with tension. That was never how it was supposed to feel. I started thinking about the future we had once imagined together. We had talked about traveling, buying a house, building careers, and eventually creating a family. Those dreams had once filled me with excitement. Now they filled me with uncertainty. If trust was already this fragile, what would happen when life introduced real challenges? Marriage would not magically erase insecurity. Children would not remove fear. More commitment could never solve a problem rooted in unresolved emotional wounds. I realized I had been hoping that the next milestone would somehow fix everything. Every new stage of the relationship had briefly distracted us before the same fears returned. Nothing external could replace internal healing. That understanding hurt because it meant I could no longer rely on hope alone. I still wanted the relationship to survive, but I finally accepted that survival required effort from both of us, not endless reassurance from only one. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine two different futures. In one, we both confronted our struggles honestly, rebuilt trust patiently, and learned healthier ways to love each other. In the other, we continued repeating the same cycle until resentment replaced affection completely. The second future frightened me far more than the possibility of being alone. I never wanted to become bitter. I never wanted to remember the woman I loved as someone who only made me anxious. I wanted to remember the laughter, the road trips, the quiet evenings, the dreams we had shared before fear became stronger than hope. No relationship deserves to be remembered only for its hardest moments. As I reflected on everything we had experienced, I understood something that had taken me more than a year to learn. Love is not measured by how much pain someone is willing to endure. It is measured by how willing people are to grow together instead of expecting one person to carry the emotional weight of both. That realization did not erase my feelings. It simply gave me the courage to stop pretending that love alone could solve problems that required trust, healing, and mutual effort. For the first time in a very long while, I allowed myself to believe that I deserved both love and peace, not one at the expense of the other. The following days felt strangely different because I had stopped lying to myself. Nothing around me had actually changed, yet my perspective had. I no longer measured the health of our relationship by the number of good days we experienced. Instead, I paid attention to how we handled the difficult ones. That was where the truth always revealed itself. I noticed how quickly happiness disappeared whenever uncertainty entered the picture. A delayed response because I was stuck in traffic could overshadow an entire weekend. An unexpected meeting at work could become the center of hours of anxious thoughts. Every explanation I offered temporarily calmed the situation, but none of them created lasting confidence. It was like pouring water into a bucket with a hole in the bottom. No matter how much reassurance I gave, it slowly leaked away until nothing remained. The realization no longer made me angry. It simply made me sad. I thought about all the energy we could have spent creating memories instead of defending against imaginary disasters. We could have planned more trips, visited new places, learned new hobbies together, or simply enjoyed quiet evenings without emotional exhaustion. Instead, so much of our time had been consumed by fear of things that had never happened. That loss felt impossible to recover. One evening I opened an old notebook where I used to write personal goals. Most of the pages were filled with ambitions about work, travel, fitness, and the kind of person I hoped to become. Reading those words felt like meeting an older version of myself who still believed the future was wide open. I asked myself a question I had avoided for months. Was I becoming the man I wanted to be? The answer came almost immediately. I was becoming someone whose decisions revolved around preventing conflict instead of pursuing happiness. That realization hurt more than anything else. Fear had quietly become the compass guiding my life. I understood then that this was bigger than one relationship. If I accepted living this way now, I would eventually forget that another way of living had ever existed. Constant emotional tension would become normal, and I refused to let that happen. For the first time, I allowed myself to imagine a future built on mutual trust rather than constant reassurance. I imagined coming home after work without preparing explanations before even opening the front door. I imagined weekends that were remembered for laughter instead of arguments. I imagined being loved for who I was instead of constantly proving who I was not. Those thoughts did not make me feel guilty. They reminded me of what a healthy relationship should look like. Looking back, I realized neither of us had intended to hurt the other. She had been protecting herself from ghosts created by people who had betrayed her long before we met. I had been trying so hard to save the relationship that I slowly abandoned pieces of myself along the way. Neither of us had been the enemy. Fear had been. That understanding gave me something I had been missing for a long time. Compassion. Not only for her, but also for myself. I finally accepted that loving someone deeply does not always mean you are the right person to heal their wounds. Some journeys cannot be completed by another hand, no matter how sincere the love may be. As painful as that truth was, it also brought an unexpected sense of peace. For months I had believed I was failing because I could not convince her to trust me completely. Now I understood that trust is not something another person can force into existence. It grows from within, nurtured by healing, honesty, and the willingness to let go of yesterday's pain. I had given everything I knew how to give. My loyalty had never wavered. My patience had never been fake. My love had always been genuine. Sometimes that still is not enough. Accepting that fact did not make me feel defeated. It made me feel free. Free from the impossible responsibility of fixing wounds I had never created. Free from believing every misunderstanding was my fault. Free from carrying guilt for problems beyond my control. As I looked toward the future, I no longer wished for a perfect relationship because perfection had never existed. A relationship where trust was stronger than fear. Where honesty was believed instead of questioned. Where silence felt peaceful instead of suspicious. Where love inspired growth instead of constant anxiety. Those hopes no longer felt unrealistic. They felt necessary. No matter what happened next, I knew this experience would stay with me forever. It had taught me that real love requires vulnerability, but vulnerability should never mean surrendering your identity. Caring for someone should never require abandoning your own emotional well-being. I would always be grateful for the beautiful moments we shared because they were real. They reminded me that happiness had existed between us, even if we could not hold onto it forever. At the same time, I would never ignore the lessons hidden inside the painful moments. They taught me that trust is not a luxury in a relationship. It is the foundation that allows every other part of love to stand. Without it, even the strongest feelings eventually begin to collapse under the weight of doubt. As I closed that chapter of my life, I carried no hatred, no desire for revenge, and no satisfaction in admitting that we had struggled. I carried hope, hope that she would someday discover peace inside herself, hope that I would never again mistake endless sacrifice for unconditional love, and hope that when I finally found the person meant to walk beside me, we would spend far less time proving our love and far more time simply living it.